Hello and welcome back to International Economics. Now we're going to cover chapter 4, namely the topic of tariffs. Tariffs are basically a tax on imported goods and services. There are different types of tariffs. These tariffs may be applied to import goods or to export goods as well. Typically, in developed nations, we tend to observe mostly taxes on imported goods. Export goods are taxed typically in less developed countries or developing countries. Why? Well, because it's another mechanism for the local governments to collect tax revenue. When tax evasion is a sport, the governments try every possible mechanism that they can to gather taxes. So, as the borders are typically already controlled by nations, it's a easy spot to collect taxes. So, the nature of tariffs can be protective or pure revenue gathering. Protective in the sense that insulates domestic producers against foreign competition in different degrees according to how big the tariff is. And on the other hand is a revenue gathering mechanism for the local government. For example, here you are shown in table 4.1 average tariff revenues as a percentage of the government revenues in some countries. And as you can see, in developing countries, tariffs represent a huge percentage of the government revenue, whereas in industrial countries, or also known as developed countries, this percentage is quite small. So again, the need for the local governments to use any potential mechanism when institutions like the local IRS are weak or unable to collect taxes from their citizens, then the border control and goods passing the border in or out are an effective way, well, better than the other ones available, to collect government revenues. Therefore, in these countries, it's a big source of their revenue. For example, when you travel to some South American countries, to some countries in general, you are taxed at the border to get in as a tourist. You have to pay something like $50 just to get in, or more, depending on the country we're talking about. Again, why is this done? The need for government revenues in these weaker economies with weaker institutions. Now, there are different types of tariffs. There is the specific tariff, which is basically a tax denominated as a fixed amount of money per unit of the good that is imported. It's a dollar amount per unit of the good imported. There's the ad valorem tariff, which is basically a fixed percentage of the value of the good imported, not a fixed dollar amount, but rather a percentage, a fixed percentage. The key difference between the specific tariff and the ad valorem is the degree of protectionism that they offer. Because if it's a specific dollar amount, the degree of protectionism depends on the value of the good. And let's say that a pound of coffee costs $5. So $1 represents 20% tax. If the price of coffee goes up to $10 a pound and we keep on using a specific tariff, then $1 now represents merely 10%. So in effective terms, the degree of protectionism went down. Therefore, the usage of tariffs as a percentage of the value of the product is a more effective way to keep protecting the domestic producers in the same relative extent. Now, the issue related with the ad valorem taxes is that is a percentage of the value of the good. So, the valuation of the price of the good is a quite difficult exercise where there are a lot of norms and efforts to try to standardize this valuation process. So we have free on board valuation, And then you have the valuation using adding to the cost of the product the cost of insurance and freight. Okay, so this is the debate, which one should be used. Then, in addition to the specific tariff, to the ad valorem tariff, we have the compound tariff. So as the name indicates, is a combo of both. There's going to be a part of the tariff that is a fixed dollar amount, and then this tariff is added with a percentage on the value of the good that is imported. And here you go. You have specific tariffs for brooms, fishing reels, and wristwatches, 32 cents each, 44 cents each, 29 cents each. And then you have the ad valorem tariff, a fixed percentage of the value of ball bearings, electric motors, and bicycles. And then you have here the compound tariffs. For example, wool blankets, you pay 1.8 cents per kilogram imported plus 6% of the value of those blankets. Similarly, for the electricity meters, 60 cents per each one imported plus 1.5% of its value. Now we are at the US International Trade Commission website and looking at real data about the harmonized tariff schedule for 2017. So here, if you engage in international trade, you have all the description for different types of products. For example, Section 1, live animals and animal products. Section 2, vegetable products. And discriminated different types of products and families of products. So pretty much everything that enters the US is described here. Section 5, mineral products. Section 6, products of the chemical or allied industries, and so on. Now, if you click here in the general notes, you end up with a PDF file where it describes the rates of duty. And let me show you an example. This is chapter 87 for vehicles and motorcycles. You can see, for example, here we're describing motorcycles not exceeding 50 cc, and it's free in general. Note that here you have the rates of duty, and there's two columns, column 1 and column 2. Column 1 breaks in two subsections, general and special. Section 2 is for the countries that we have significant trade restrictions. So this is pretty much to everybody. Special is when we have trade agreements with particular countries or some kind of specific consideration for a particular product. And number 2 is for countries that we have specific and restrictive trade barriers. In this case, currently is North Korea and Cuba that fall here, even though there's been progress in the harmonization of relations with Cuba, but still makes part of the 2017 countries that are covered in Section 2. So, for example, it's free to import motorcycles with less than 50 cc pretty much from every country in the world, except that if you import those from North Korea or Cuba, you have to pay 10% tax. That's what is described in that general notes file. Here, the rates of duty. The rates of duty in the rates of duty column designated 1, general and special, and 2 of the tariff schedule apply to goods imported in the customs territory of the United States and hidden in after provided in this note. So I pretty much just summarized it here, but you should read the specificities, particularly if you engage in international trade in the near future. So this is a very useful tool. When it comes to column 2, the countries are described here, those that fit in column 2. So let's get back to our real-world example when it comes to motorcycles and look at this case. For example, talking about motorcycles exceeding 700cc but not exceeding 800cc. So it's no longer free in this case. For most countries, he has to pay 2.4%. However, there are some countries with which we have special trade agreements. So Australia, Chile, Canada, Mexico. So Canada and Mexico being the North American Free Trade Agreement. And there's also a couple of other countries like Chile that we also have free trade agreements with them in this specific category. And still 10% for Cuba and North Korea. So you can browse all these. There are different cases. You should check for every product that is supposed to enter the borders of the United States if there is a tariff specific to it or if it's free. This is the source where you look for all that information. This link is below the video in our Canvas webpage. Now, table 4.3 shows a couple of examples of tariffs in selected countries as the average percentage. For example, textiles and clothing on average are taxed 9.6%, the foreign textiles and clothing, when they enter the US market. In Canada, this percentage is about 11.7%, Japan 7.4%, China 17.5%, and the European 7.9%. Let's look, for example, at sugar. In the United States, the average tariff is 13%, Canada 44.3%, in Japan 10.2%, in China 33.6%, and the European Union 11.4%. So every country that is portrayed here charges a different tariff, and the least developed of all these 5 countries charges the highest tariffs. Note that in all instances, in all goods described here, China charges higher tariffs than the rest of the countries. This discrepancy has been diminishing through efforts of the World Trade Organization, which China joined in 2000, early 2000s. And but this still accommodated in this way because China is a developing country and the other countries are industrial countries, developed countries. And developed countries tend to charge less taxes than developing countries. Taxes on foreign goods and services, what we call tariffs. Now, what is the effective rate of protection when countries decide to apply these tariffs? Well, there's a fairly simple way to compute it. We need to distinguish between the nominal tariff and the effective tariff. And the way we do that is by computing this formula. This is the formula for the effective rate of protection. So, for example, if E is equal to 30%, then the interpretation is that the effective tariff rate is 30%, and therefore domestic producers are producing more 30% than they would without protectionism. Okay, so let's look at the definition of each variable. N stands for the nominal tariff on the final product. That's the one that is published. A stands for the ratio of the value of the imported input to the value of the finished product. So let's say that what we import is just 20% of the final good we want to do with those imported raw materials. That will be the value for A. If what we import is the final product, then this will be 1. B, the nominal tariff on the imported input. So this is the tariff that is taxed not on the final product, but on the raw materials or intermediate products that we need to produce the final product. Again, N is the rate applied to the final product. B is the rate applied to any intermediary products we need to produce a final product. A is how much do those intermediary inputs account for in the final product. And then divided by 1 minus that percentage, that share that the intermediary inputs represent out of the final product. So let's do some computations. Let's talk about the effective rate of protection. Recall that we're going to use E to denominate the effective rate of protection, N to denominate the nominal tariff on the final product, A as the ratio that the value of the imported inputs represents out of the value of the finished product, and B the nominal tariff on that imported input. Okay. So let's do an example. Let's say that N is equal to 0.6, which is the tariff on the final product. What we're going to import represents about 20% of the value of the final product, so A equal to 0.2, and the tax on that intermediary input is 50%, same as to say 0.5. Then the effective rate of protection would be equal to the tariff on the final product, the percentage that the imported input represents times the tariff on that intermediate input, 1 minus the percentage that the imported input represents out of the final product. So 0.6 minus 0.2 times 0.5 divided by 1 minus 0.2. This gives 0.6 minus 0.1 divided by 0.8, and this value is 0.625, which roughly speaking means that domestic producers are going to be producing 62.5% more than they would without the protection. Okay. Roughly that's what that means. That's the proxy that we use in economics. Now what if N is 0.4, meaning that the tariff on the final product is lower than the tariff on the intermediate input? What's going to happen in this case? Well, the effective rate of protection therefore is 0.4 minus 0.2 times 0.5 divided by 1 minus 0.2, meaning that now we're going to have 0.4 minus 0.1 divided by 0.8, and this is going to give 0.375. So now, in this scenario, the degree of effective protection goes down to 37.5%. What can you infer from here? Is that as long as the tariff on the final product is greater than the tariff on the intermediate input, the rate of protection is going to be higher than the nominal tariff on the final product. If the tariff on the final product is lower than the one applied to the intermediate input, then the effective degree of protectionism is going to be lower than the tariff on the final product. This is what I explained in the following slides. So read them. Now let's use this formula to make additional insights. Let's say that we want to assess the impact that a change in n will have in the effective rate of protection. So what we are inferring is basically what is the derivative, the change in the effective rate of protection, if there was to be a one unit marginal increase in the tariff on the final product. So the derivative of the effective rate of protection with respect to n, it's equal to, given that this is the expression, so n shows up on the numerator, as you recall from your calculus classes, then this is going to be equal to the derivative of what is in the top times whatever is in the denominator. So we're going to have 1, the derivative of n is itself, then these are not n, so this is 0. So 1 times whatever is on the denominator minus what is on the top times the derivative of what is in the denominator with respect to n. And there's no n, so that will be 0, divided by what is in the denominator squared. So this is going to reduce to this expression, and as A, remember that A is the percentage that the imported input represents out of our final product. So therefore, it has to be less than another percent, otherwise it will be the final product itself, right? And greater than 0. It has to represent a portion of it, right? So A is bounded between 1 and 0. Therefore, this number is positive. And plugging the value of A for the specific case we'll be contemplating will give you the exact number that the change in the effective rate of protection will be if n was to increase by 1 marginal unit. So the interpretation is, if n increases marginally, right? In economics, marginally means by 1 unit, taking into account the units in which this is measured, so this will be in percentages. Then the effective rate of protection would increase by 1 minus 1 over A, by 1 divided by 1 minus A, per each unit increase in n. Now, what if is the percentage that the imported input represents on the final product? Well, in this case, note that A shows up at the bottom and at the top, so it will be a little bit more messy, meaning that the derivative of the numerator with respect to A is going to be minus B. So we have 0 minus the derivative of A, which is 1, times B, right? And then times A times the derivative of B with respect to A, which is 0. So that's what's going to be on the top. First, multiplying by what is at the denominator minus what is on the top times the derivative of what is in the denominator. So the derivative of 1 is 0 and the derivative of A is 1, divided by 1 minus A squared. So let's break this down. What we're going to have here is minus B times 1, and then minus B times minus A, so gives plus BA. And here we're going to have minus 1 times this stuff, so minus, with that minus turns into a plus, so plus n minus ab divided by 1 minus a squared. Now you can see these two cancel, and you end up with n minus b 1 minus a squared. So what is the conclusion in this case? Well, whatever is in the denominator, as it is square, this is always going to be a positive number. So this part here is always positive because it's square. Right. Whatever is on the top, on the numerator, could be positive or negative depending on the relationship between n and b. Right. So if n is greater than b, what we have is that the derivative of e with respect to a is positive. If n is less than b, then the derivative with respect of the effective rate of protectionism with respect to a is going to be negative. So the effective rate of protectionism, I forgot to put that derivative sign. The effective rate of protectionism with respect to A can be positive or negative. You will be positive if the tariff on the final product is greater than the tariff on the intermediate input. You will be negative if the tariff on the final product is lower than the tariff on the imported input. Nonetheless, it's going to be positive or negative by this amount per each marginal increase in A. Okay. Thus, per each marginal increase in A, the effective rate of protection will change by n minus b divided by 1 minus a squared. This value is positive if n greater than b, and is negative if n is less than b. Okay, so per each 1 unit increase in the tariff on the final product, the effective rate of protection increases. That's always the case. If what we import represents an increasing portion of the final product, the rate of protection goes up if the tariff of the final good is greater than the tariff of the intermediate input. The rate of protection will go down if the tariff on the final product is lower than the tariff on the intermediate input. So the last case to contemplate is what happens when there is a marginal change on the tariff in the imported input. So what is the derivative of E with respect to B? Given that's the expression, so again, derivative what is on the top with respect to B, in this case is going to be minus A, times what is on the bottom, minus what is on the top, times the derivative of what is on the bottom with respect to B. There is no B, so it's 0. Divided by 1 minus A squared. So this reduces to minus A times 1 minus A divided by 1 minus A squared. This cancel with that, so you end up with minus a, 1 minus a. Given that a is bounded between 1 and 0, this denominator is still positive. A is positive, but is multiplied by minus sign. So this is going to be negative. Thus, for each marginal change in this case is really increase, right? Marginal increase in B, which is the tariff on the intermediate input. The effective rate of protection, E, will decrease by A divided by 1 minus A. Okay. For each marginal change, so it's per unit of change, whatever is the unit of measurement. Okay. So, in summary, this mathematical analysis allows you to take some rules of thumb, which is, if n increases, the effective rate of protection increases. If B increases, the effective rate of protection decreases. If what we import increases as a percentage of the final product, okay, the relevance of that import, then we can have two scenarios. The rate of protection increases if the tariff on the final product is greater than the tariff on the imported product, and conversely, the effective rate of protection can decrease if we have a tariff on the final product that is lower than the tariff on the intermediate input. So these conclusions allow you to solve some theoretical questions as well. The next topic is tariff escalation. What it means is we typically observe that tariffs go up the more processed the imported good is. For example, figure point 1 shows what's going on in Japan, the European Union, the United States, and Canada when it comes to tariffs of two different categories of goods. Here on the left graph we have agricultural goods, and on the right graph we have industrial products. So let's look at these bars. These bars show the average tariff per type of good, and these types are discriminated according to their level of processing. So first stage goods, which have minimal processing, as you can see, typically are taxed lower than semi-processed goods, the white bar, and fully processed agricultural goods. Okay? So that's the tariff escalation scenario. For example, in the United States, is different from the other countries or regions portrayed here because it taxes less on semi-processed agricultural products than first stage agricultural products. But all the others follow the expected tariff escalation. Okay? This is done because the US finds particularly relevant to tax less these semi-processed goods because it's going to use it to produce fully processed goods. It gives more importance to it than the other countries do. When it comes to industrial products, then what we see is the semi-processed products, industrial products, are typically taxed more than the first stage, minimal processing, or fully processed goods. Okay? So we see this pattern in Japan, European Union, and the United States, not in Canada. The Canada still follows the expected tariff escalation, whereas these other industrial nations, they are protecting more heavily their industries that operate in the semi-processed industrial products. So Within the realm of this protectionism, there is this also facilities to help domestic producers lower their production costs. One of them is related to outsourcing, so firms typically outsource to minimize their cost structures. And these tariff escalation issues that we just saw tends to have higher tariffs in fully processed goods, so outsourcing the lower levels of processing still makes sense given that the tariffs are not as high. Outsourcing is used to use, for example, unique foreign production technologies, unique labor skills, raw materials, or the abundance of specialized components in those other countries that makes the production in those countries cheaper than at home. Obviously, that low labor costs also make part of this outsourcing surge. Now, what is an offshore assembly provision? This is a favorable tariff treatment to products that are produced in foreign nations but use domestically produced components. So, when importing these final goods back, let's say, to the US, if part of them, the components of those goods, were produced by domestic producers, then it will have a favorable tax treatment. Basically, that part of the cost of the imported good is going to be ignored for tariff purposes. So it's an incentive for foreign producers to use US made components. Now, when dodging tariffs, do we need to pay attention to how is this done? Because avoidance is legal, evasion is illegal. Tariff avoidance is using legal mechanisms contemplated in the law that allow you to reduce your tariff dues. For example, the offshore assembly provision. It's a legal way to avoid paying some tariffs. Evasion is basically lying about it, not declaring to the government the import of goods that are due a tariff. Example of Ford Motor Company avoiding paying too many tariffs. The example that Carabao goes on relates to the production of cargo vans. So the Ford company, if it was to import cargo vans, meaning, for example, having a plant in another country producing the cargo vans there because labor is cheaper, and then importing them back to the US as cargo vans, the tariff duty will be 25%. And given the example described in the book, this would amount to $6,250. Now, what Ford Motor Company does is to produce wagons in Turkey and then ship them to Baltimore. And they ship them as wagons, not cargo vans, because the tariff on wagons is 2.5%. So they end up paying just $625 in tariffs per wagon imported instead of cargo vans. Then what they do is to take out the seats, put that wagon as a cargo van and sell it in the domestic market. Even though this may sound fuzzy, it's completely legal because the good that passes the border, the imported good, is a wagon, not a cargo van. Then what you do to the product, it's up to Ford. So this is an example of tax avoidance. Now, tax evasion is, for example, smuggled steel. What it means is that steel enters the country classified as something else and therefore evades paying the import duty. This is illegal. Another facility that domestic producers can use when importing components, inputs into their production process, is to use these bonded warehouse facilities that basically allow you to delay the payment of the tariffs as long as they are not withdrawn for domestic consumption. So you can delay for a maximum of 5 years paying duties on those imported goods, and as time is money, this is a benefit given to US importers and producers. Another curious facility is the foreign trade zones. So these are areas within the US where the business can operate without paying duties up to the point that the good is sold to the US market. And these foreign trade zones, FTZs, they exist pretty much all over the US. So one of the links below the video in your Canvas webpage is to the government site that shows you the foreign trade zones per state. This site is from the US Department of Commerce and shows you all the foreign trade zones in the US. Pretty much zip codes where you can set up your facilities and delay paying tariffs up to the point that those goods are commercialized in the US market. So let's pick the state of Michigan. And for example, in Michigan, we have several foreign trade zones: Sault Ste. Marie, Battle Creek, Detroit, Saginaw, Grand Rapids, and so on. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 foreign trade zones in Michigan alone. You also can see who runs those foreign trade zones. So for example, in St. Marie is the Economic Development Corporation, and then they grant license to firms to operate there. In Battle Creek is the city. In Detroit is the Greater Detroit Foreign Trade Zone Incorporated, the city of Flint, and then many companies can operate in these areas. So if you are dealing in international trade, these are mechanisms available to minimize your costs and therefore maximize your profits. Now we're going to look into the tariff effects in the overall economy. And to do this, we're going to review the concepts of consumer surplus and producer surplus that you learn in Principles of Economics. And I'm going to show you in detail how this assessment is done. The textbook as well as the slides provide you a context for this review, so you should read them and also watch what's coming next, which is my explanation step by step of this analysis. Now figure point 2 serves as a basis to review the concepts of consumer surplus and producer surplus. So basically, consumer surplus is a proxy for the benefits that the consumers have from participating in the market, whereas the producer surplus proxies the benefits that producers have from participating in the market. These are computed as areas, okay? So look, what is the consumer surplus in this case? It's basically equal to the area of the triangle. The triangle here is bounded by what is the maximum price the consumers would be willing to pay for the first unit that comes available in the market, and by the equilibrium price, which is the price at which they actually pay for the product, and bounded by the demand curve, by the price, what they actually pay, and the maximum they were willing to pay for the first unit available in the market. Therefore, in this case, what we have here, the area of the triangle is the rise times the run. This will be the area for a square. As it is a triangle, we divide by 2. So we have the rise is 4 minus 2. The rise from here there is 2 units, $2 in this case. And the run is from 0 to 4. So times 4 minus 0, if we want to be precise, divided by 2. So this is 4. 8 divided by 2. Similarly, the producer surplus, so the producer surplus is also equal to the area of the triangle. This time, the triangle is delimited by what is the minimum price that they would accept to start producing the first unit. So this has really no economic interpretation at this point because the value here is 0. So they wouldn't produce for free, that's for sure, but the intercept is there, so we have to assume 0 as the value. And then what is the price that they actually get paid, which is $2. And then the run is the quantity that they actually sold. So it's going to look similar in this example to the previous consumer surplus. The producer surplus, the rise is 0 to 2, so 2 minus 0 times the run, 4 minus 0, divided by 2. Therefore, you have again 8 divided by 2. This is denominated in dollars as a proxy for the benefits. And in this case, they look alike, but they do not need to look alike. In this situation, assuming that there is no government in this economy, then the welfare of this nation would be equal to the producer surplus plus the consumer surplus. Or since we're starting from left to right, we can put consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So we found 4 plus 4. So the total welfare in this nation, if there was just this product, would be $8. This is a brief review of the producer and consumer surplus. Now we're going to derive step by step the impact of moving from a closed economy to an open economy, and then moving from a free open economy to an open economy with a tariff. The base of that rationale is going to be this figure 4.3, which is described thoroughly in the textbook. We're going to add some assumptions to it. We're going to create an intercept for this domestic demand curve. We're going to set it at 15,000. And we're going to create an intercept for this domestic supply curve. We're going to set it at 4,000. So let's do that by hand. So here I have a replica of figure 4.3. Note that in relation to the one that you have to the slide, what we added was a value for the intercept for the domestic demand curve and domestic supply curve. Okay. Now, let's start with point E. Point E is the equilibrium when you consider just the domestic supply and the domestic demand with no international trade. So this will be the autarky scenario. Let's compute how much is the welfare of this nation if it's comprised just with this market, just with this product, in the case of a closed economy. So from figure 4.3 we have the equilibrium, E standing for autarky equilibrium. At $9,500 per automobile. This is the quantity of automobiles, and 50 of them are consumed domestically. So if the intercept for the demand curve is 15,000 and for the supply curve is 4,000, we then will have a consumer surplus under the autarky scenario equal to, well, what is the consumer surplus? The triangle bounded by how much were the domestic consumers willing to pay for the first unit available. That's the intercept of the demand curve. How much are they actually paying at equilibrium? And taking into account the quantity that clears the market. So the rise over the run divided by 2 gives you the area of the triangle. The rise is 15,000 minus 9,500, and the run is 50 minus 0 divided by 2. This will give you a value of 137,500 bucks. Then the producer surplus, following a similar rationale, is the area bounded by what is the minimum price the suppliers would be willing to accept for the first unit introduced in the market, and how much they are actually paid, so the rise. And then the run is the quantity that they actually sell. So this here is the producer surplus, and what we just computed was the consumer surplus. The upper triangle, consumer surplus, the lower triangle, the producer surplus. So the producer surplus has a rise of 9,500 minus 4,000 times a run of also 50 units. These will account for also 137,500 bucks. So at the end, the welfare of this nation, we are ignoring all other actors, economic agents. We're assuming that there's just this market and there's just these suppliers and just these demanders. Then the welfare comprises the addition of the benefits that both enjoy, both the consumers and the producers. So these will account to consumer surplus plus producer surplus, hence $275,000. Now, let's say that this nation decides to open the borders to trade, and as such is going to take the world price as given because it is a small open economy. A small open economy means that the economy is so small that has no bargaining power over world prices. It basically takes them as given. This small nation is a price taker, not a price maker. As a price taker, basically it means that it takes the world price for any quantity it demands. And according to figure 4.3, the simulation is $8,000 that the world price for cars is. And at this price, given that it's lower than the initial one, consumers will be happier and consume more because it's cheaper. So this is what we're going to call the scenario for free trade. Right? The quantity demanded at that point goes all the way to 80. However, the quantity domestically produced, let's call this F prime, is going to reduce significantly. And according to this simulated scenario, it is going to go all the way to 20. So you can already imagine how dissatisfied the domestic producers are going to be. However, the domestic consumers are quite happy. Let's assess these levels of satisfaction and dissatisfaction using the consumer and producer surplus tool. So the consumer surplus in this case is going to be, well, the rise is 15,000 minus the new equilibrium price, which is 8,000, and the run now is 80, all the way from 0 280. That's this part of the triangle. And we got the rise from the vertical axis. Divided by 2, because it's a triangle, not a square. We're going to get a consumer surplus of $280,000. So all this area here, this triangle, is the consumer surplus now. The benefits for the consumer got much larger compared to a closed economy scenario. Accounts for $280,000. The producer surplus is just this tiny triangle now. This tiny triangle. So how much is it? The rise is 8,000, the equilibrium price minus the minimum they were willing to accept for the first unit, times the run, so 20. Is now $40,000. Okay? So the welfare for this nation, which accounts for the summation of the consumer surplus and producer surplus as before, is going to amount to $320,000. So consumer surplus of 280 plus a producer surplus of 40,000, so an aggregate value of $320,000. Note that we conquered, through opening the borders to trade, benefits that were not enjoyed by anybody before. So this area previously did not belong neither to the consumer surplus nor to the producer surplus. I'm talking about this lower triangle. So we expanded compared to what we used to have, and the overall economy now is much better, $320,000 compared to the $275,000 it previously enjoyed. So as you can imagine, the domestic producers are going to be highly dissatisfied. Their producer surplus just went down from $137,500 to merely $40,000. So let's assume that they're going to spend a lot of lobby dollars to ask legislators for protectionism. And let's assume that they got it. The amount of protectionism in this simulated example is going to be $1,000 per unit imported, a tariff of $1,000. So what's going to happen in that scenario? So under free trade, the price was 8,000. Now it's going to be 9,000. There is an increment of a $1,000 tariff. That's the reason for that hike. As a consequence, consumption is going to go down from 80 to 60 because now the cars are more expensive than $8,000, so consumption declines as expected. However, the production will increase because now more suppliers are willing to participate in the market given that the price went up. What is the new consumer surplus at this point? So the new consumer surplus is going to be bounded by the highest price and the price that they actually pay. So all this area here now is the consumer surplus. Note that I'm using G and G prime to denote the case of a tariff, and G because the textbook is using G for that point, so I don't want to confuse you. So let's compute the new consumer surplus with the tariff. The rise is 15,000 minus the new equilibrium price, which is 9,000. And the run now is just 60. This will amount to a consumer surplus of $180,000. The producer surplus is now, well, 4,000, the minimum to participate, but they are getting 9,000. They are actually paid 9,000. So this is the rise. The run now is 40. That's how much they are able to sell. So this area over here is the new producer surplus. Okay. Goes all the way there. It's bounded by this triangle. So the producer surplus, the rise is 9,000 minus 4,000, and the run is 40. So this will amount to $100,000. Now, when computing the welfare, we need to take into account this government intervention. The government is charging a tariff to foreigners that wish to sell in our market, and that tariff is $1,000 per unit imported. So there is a government revenue, which in this case is equal to the tariff revenue, which is equal to the amount of imports times the tariff per import. This is a specific tariff because it's $1,000 per unit imported. Remember that the difference is an ad valorem tariff, is a percentage of the value of the good. This is a specific tariff, a specific dollar amount per unit imported. So now, how many units are imported? Well, we consume 60 units domestically. That's where the demand curve, the domestic demand curve, intersects the curve that takes into account the domestic supply, the world supply, plus the tariff. So 60 are consumed domestically and 40 are produced domestically. Thus, the imports are the difference between what is consumed and how much is domestically produced. So we have a $20,000 government revenue that stays in this nation. So basically what we computed was the area of this rectangle that has a run equal to the amount of imports, which are 20, and the height equal to the amount of the tariff. We also call these, and the figure 4.3 denotes this area as area C. We also call these the revenue effect. Okay. This area C is retained in the economy in the form of tariff revenue by the government. So the welfare of this nation is now equal as the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus, but differently from the other scenarios, we now are going to add the tariff revenue because it's kept by the government of this nation. So the welfare of this nation, taking into account the benefits of the consumer, the producer, and the government, equate 180,000 plus 100,000 plus 20,000 to a grand total of 300,000. Okay. So what happened? Well, under the open economy, we were maximizing our welfare at 320,000. Free trade, 320,000. Then, to satisfy the outcry for protectionism by domestic producers, a tariff was introduced. The domestic producers got better as the result of their lobbying. They had previously a 40,000 producer surplus and now went up to 100,000. Still not as good as the surplus they enjoyed under a closed economy when they were not facing foreign competition. Right? They had the producer surplus of 137,500 bucks. However, the overall economy benefited from opening the borders to trade, and particularly the consumers. Note, the consumers start when it's a closed economy with 137,500 bucks, and the economy as a whole had a welfare of $275,000. When he moved to free trade, the consumer surplus went all the way to 280. So clearly the winners, but there were losers too, the producer surplus. However, the net effect on the economy is an improvement to $320,000 welfare. 275 before. However, certain groups in society were dissatisfied, particularly producers. If we give some form of protectionism to them, the level of welfare is no longer going to be maximized, but it doesn't need to be as bad as the case of a closed economy. So under the tariff scenario, the welfare goes all the way to 300,000. It's not 320 as in the free economy. It's not 275 as in the closed economy. So it's an in-between situation in order to satisfy the outcry for protectionism from the producers. After all, we have been seeing a lot of these kind of situations when lobbying dollars have a significant force in altering legislation. Now, during this process of moving from a free, open economy to an open economy with protectionism, there were some trade-offs that are worth it to look into more detail. So, we already talked about the revenue effect. Now, this area over here, this triangle limited by how much was consumption before protectionism, how much is consumption after protectionism, and how much was the amount of the tariff. This is what we call area D in figure 4.3. And that area D is the so-called consumption effect. Okay, actually small cap D, not to confuse with demand. This consumption effect measures the losses that the economy experiences in consumption due to protectionism. And it can be measured, after all, still an area. It's a triangle as usual. So this area D, the consumption effect, is going to be equal again to the rise times the run divided by 2. And here the rise is the amount of the tariff. So that can be seen as 9,000 minus 8,000. How much is the equilibrium price after the tariff? How much was it before the free trade? Times the change in consumption. So initially it was 80 and now it's 60. Divided by 2. And this amounts to $10,000. Another interesting effect is what we call the protective effect. How much did the domestic production increase due to the implementation of a protectionist policy? In this case was a tariff. And that's what we call area B. Okay. This area B, this triangle, is also delimited by the amount of the tariff, that's the rise, and the run is the hike, the increase in production. So area B is what we call the protective effect, basically a measure for quantifying the losses from protecting domestic consumers, the losses that the economy incurred in order to protect the domestic producers. So again is equal to the rise over the run, measured by the new equilibrium price minus the previous equilibrium price at the free trade, times the run, how much is production now, how much it was under a free trade scenario. And this amounts to $10,000 as well. Note that nobody is getting this part D and part B. The revenue effect, we considered it when computing the welfare. So it remains, this money remains in this economy. But the money that was inside the consumer surplus under free trade, namely this area here, which is the consumption effect, and the protective effect, they do not belong to anybody now. They are gone. This is what we call the welfare loss, which is approximated by adding the protective effect and the domestic effect. So this was $10,000 each. And therefore the welfare loss amounts to $20,000. Note that this is exactly the difference between how much was welfare under the tariff protection and how much was the welfare under free trade. The free trade we had $320,000 as national welfare, and now we just have $300,000. We lost those $20,000. Why? Because of the protectionism. Protectionism had two types of effects. We lost money because consumption is lower, so consumer surplus declined. This is gone, area D. And we lost welfare too because of this protection of inefficient production. Okay. We are basically subsidizing, even though this is a tariff, we are basically subsidizing, doing a wealth transfer for the producers. And in the time, we all lost. This part B, the protective effect, is gone. Now, there is another effect worth considering, which is called the redistributive effect. This is the part of the welfare that changed hands. And in this case, coming from the free trade scenario to the protectionist scenario, this area here we're going to call it area A, as is shown in figure 3. Okay, this area here, which belongs to the producers now, used to belong to the consumers. So that's what we call the redistributive effect. Area A is what we call the redistributive This redistributive effect is also known as redistribution effect. It's just to show you they are synonymous pretty much. How do you compute it? Well, it's an area, so let's compute it. Note that we can split this area into a rectangle plus a triangle. Okay? So I'm going to compute this part here first, up to 20 as a rectangle, and then I'm going to add to it this triangle. Okay? So I'm going to split it as a rectangle plus a triangle. And therefore, we have the area of the rectangle is rise times run. So this is going to be, I'm just going to spell it out so you know what I'm doing. Probably it has been a while last time you had geometry. So that's how you compute the area of each. And therefore the rise for the rectangle is $1,000, 9,000 minus 800 times the run, which is 20. So that's the rectangle portion. And then the triangle, which has the same rise, and the run is given, the run, I'm looking at this triangle over here, the run is 40 minus 20 divided by 2. So this amounts to $20,000, and here $10,000. So an aggregated total of $30,000 as the measure for the redistributive effect. So this last part was concerning into having a more granular insight into what happened during this transition from free trade to protectionism. And where did the welfare go? Well, some of it changed hands. That's the part A, redistributive effect, changed from the consumer to the producer, is now given to the producer. That's the ones that were protected, remember the protectionist measure. Then we have area C that stills in the economy because it's collected by the government in the form of tariff on imports. So this area C is still in the economy. However, area B and D are gone. And what are those? B is the protective effect. So we're basically abdicating of welfare in order to protect our producers. That's how much it costs us to be protectionist. And D, the consumption effect, which is the loss in consumption due to the implementation in protectionist measures. The loss in consumption occurs because prices go up. So that accounts for area D. This area D is gone too. So if we want to compute the dead weight loss of implementing a protectionist measure, dead weight loss, meaning welfare loss, they account to the summation of the protective effect and the consumption effect. Now we're going to look into the scenario of a large open economy. Remember that this was in relation to a small open economy. And the small open economy is a price taker because it's so small, it has no influence in world prices. So when the economy is large, it means it's more relevant. It means that its own demand may have an impact on world prices. So that's the case we're going to look next. Figure 4.4 illustrates the example for a large open economy. So what strikes you immediately is that the supply curve, when we take into account the world supply in addition to the domestic supply, is no longer a flat curve. Now we have an upward sloping curve as usual, not as steep as before, more flat, because here we have total control over the prices domestically, and here not so much, but we are not literally price takers. We are to a certain extent price makers. So the curious phenomena is pretty much, the assessment is pretty much the same up to the free trade scenario. Just the transition from free trade to government intervention, the tariff scenario, the G point, just in this transition something different occurs, which is, note that the world price, when we were a free open economy, was $8,000. And then we imposed the protectionism of $1,000 tariff. So there is a parallel shift in the supply curve, and the shift is $1,000. Given that we're gonna reduce our consumption, now coming from 110 to 90, this decrease in consumption impacts the world demand for this product, and as a consequence of it, the new equilibrium price at the world level goes down from 8,000 to 7,800, because we, the large nation, are consuming less, and our relevance shows in which our decreased consumption has the force to decrease world prices. The extent of which, of course, varies per product. It could be very small, the impact, or it could be larger. In this case was $200. Okay? So then the tariff is applied. So the product arrives to our consumers at 8,800 bucks, not the 9,000 as in the case of the closed economy. Now it arrives at 8,800 because the world price was down to 7,800, and we still apply the same $1,000 tariff. So what's going on here? Well, the consumer surplus compared to the free open economy also declines. Right? So what is the difference in this assessment? Well, we still have the protective effect captured by this area B. This is gone. We still have the consumption effect. That is gone. We still have the revenue effect or tariff effect. This remains in the economy. This square over here, well, rectangle. This remains in the economy. What is gone is B and D. We still have the consumer surplus. We still have the consumer surplus here. We still have the producer surplus. We can still assess the redistributive effect, comes from here. This part used to belong to the consumers, now is in the hands of the producers. And you can compute the protective effect, you can compute the consumption effect, you can compute the tariff effect. But now there's something new, which is we actually benefited from this decline in world prices. How can we quantify the benefits coming from these lower world prices? Well, that's what this area E, which is the impact of the terms of trade, the terms of trade effect, captures. This area E is this rectangle that accounts for the discount in the price, went down $200, so that's the height over there. The run is equal to the amount of imports, 90 consumed domestically, 50 produced domestically, so we have 40 units as imports. So this rectangle is the terms of trade effect. So how can we assess the impact, the deadweight loss, of changing from a free open economy to one with protectionism, with a tariff? We have to quantify the losses, right? So the losses are, like before, the protective effect plus the consumption effect. The gains are equal to the improvement in the terms of trade, the discount we are getting because we are buying less. Okay? That has an impact on the equilibrium world price of this product. So let's play with these numbers over here. So area B, like before, we can compute the area of the triangle. Let's put area B here. Is 8,800 minus 7,800 times the amount that production increased, so 50 minus 30. That's the protective effect. Now the consumption effect, this triangle D. So the rise is the tariff value, 1,000, and the amount of decline in consumption is 20. It's 110 minus 90. So our losses amount to $40,000. Okay. What about our gains? Well, E is equal to the area of this rectangle. The height of the rectangle is equal to the reduction in price. So it's equal to 8,000 minus 7,800 times the run, which is the amount of imports. Those are 40, which is 90 minus 50. So this equates to $8,000. So the deadweight loss it's equal to B plus D minus E, because the gains offset our losses. In this case will be 20,000 plus 20,000 minus 8,000, so $32,000. So what you see in this example is, even though being a large open economy yields benefits because of our bargaining power, the degree to which we are price makers, it typically does not offset the overall losses that we have. This is the typical scenario. Yes, a large open economy is going to endure smaller losses in relative terms compared to a small economy because of its bargaining power, its capacity to improve the terms of trade. So there's benefits from that. However, this improvement in terms of trade is not big enough to offset the losses incurred by the protective effect and the consumption effect. However, it's worth contemplating, as one of the slides in your PowerPoint presentation shows, the following scenarios, which is if B plus D are greater than E, so if the protective effect plus the consumption effect are greater than the improvement in the terms of trade, there is a welfare loss. This is the typical scenario. However, it's mathematically possible that B plus D are smaller than E. And in that case, we'll have a welfare gain. It's also mathematically possible that B plus D are equal to E, and therefore there will be no change in welfare. Okay? So this one here is the typical scenario. However, it could be the case that the other two instances occur because, after all, it's mathematically possible. However, not normal. So, in sum, tariffs impose a decline in welfare when compared to the scenario of free trade. Free trade is the situation that maximizes national welfare. However, when engaging in opening the borders to trade, the nation should expect a group of winners and a group of losers. Losers are those that are not able to compete in the global markets, okay? Not able to compete with the prices at which those goods are imported at. And therefore, as the producer surplus declines, it's not surprisingly, as the real world shows us over and over, that these groups lobby for protectionism. This could be the producers themselves, as well as the workers of those factories. So you have unions, you have chambers of commerce or other forms of trade associations also lobbying for protectionism. Basically, the industry that is affected as a whole starts spending lobbying dollars in order to have some form of protectionism in their favor. Of course, that this comes at the expense of the nation as a whole. The economic theory advocates that the free, open economy is the best possible outcome for a nation in order to maximize its welfare. Figure 4.5 illustrates how an import tariff burdens domestic exporters. The underlying scenario is, assume a domestic producer that needs to import components to make its final good in the home nation. So if those inputs are charged higher prices, what's going to happen? What you have here is a typical setup from principles of economics where maximization occurs, where the marginal cost equates the marginal revenue. So this is determining the optimal quantity to be produced, and then from here, from this quantity, you extrapolate to the demand function what is going to be the prevail market price. So let's compute the profits of this producer before and after its inputs, foreign made inputs are taxed. So before tariff, recall that profits are basically equal to revenues minus costs. We are ignoring taxes here for simplicity. So what are the revenues? Well, price times quantity. So the revenues are going to be, we're going to produce 100 units and sell it at 110,000 each. We're talking about tractors or bulldozers. And then the costs are equal to the same 100 units, and each one of them costs 100,000 to produce. So the profits are $1 million. After tariff. What's going on after tariff? Well, those inputs are going to arrive at a higher cost, right? They translate into higher production costs for domestic producers. So we assume a $5,000 increase. Well, as such, this is where the marginal revenue curve intersects the new marginal cost curve, and it tells you what is the optimal quantity to be produced. And then from this quantity, you go to the demand function and find what is going to be the prevailing sell price. So, profits. Well, the quantity produced is 90 now. Each one is sold at $112,500. And then the costs for those very same 90 units produced is $105,000 each. So the profits now amount to $675,000. So after tariff, because it imposed an increase in production costs, the profits of these companies shrink. Before proceeding, you should read slides 30 through 54, because that's pretty much what we did with the graphical examination of the tariff effects on the welfare of the nation. And now we're going to proceed with the remaining contents. We're starting from a real-world example when President Bush decided to impose an import tariff on steel. So obviously the goal was to revitalize the steel industry in the US by protecting it more. It did in fact save temporarily 6,000 jobs. However, the average cost of each job saved amounted to about a number around $1 million. The figure is estimated to be between $800,000 and $1.1 million per job saved. So this is pretty much the summation of the welfare loss, taking into account any potential benefits in the terms of trade improvement. But even so, when we divide that by the 6,000 jobs saved, the losses amounted to a figure within this estimate, meaning the whole nation lost. Each job saved in the steel industry came at the cost of 13 jobs in the steel using industry. Think about this. If we save the steel manufacturers, what's going to happen to the costs of those that use the steel produced? So imagine, for example, Caterpillar versus Nucor. Nucor produces steel. Caterpillar needs to buy steel to make bulldozers. If there are increased tariffs into foreign imported steel, then the costs of Caterpillar are going to go up and make it less competitive. And in this case, when we aggregate the losses for all steel using industries in the US, it came at a trade-off of one job saved in the steel industry and simultaneously 13 jobs lost in the steel using industries. So protectionism comes at an expense of society as a whole. In 2007, these tariffs were revoked by the government. Another interesting issue related to tariffs is that they unequally impact different people, and typically it's more aggravated among the poor. Look, for example, talking about handbags. If you buy the cheap stuff, plastic-made handbags, the average tariff on those products is 16.8%. Instead, if you buy the luxury ones made of, for example, reptile leather, the average tariff rate is merely 5.3%. Drinking glasses. If you buy the cheap stuff, 30 cents or less, these pay an average of 30.4% as a tariff. If you buy more expensive stuff, they pay on average 5%. And if you buy the lead glass, it's merely 3%. So what you see here is a regressive tariff system. Imposes a lower burden to the people that buy the expensive stuff. So therefore, that's why it's argued that tariffs are inequitable. The remaining of the slides basically discuss in more detail topics that we already covered throughout this presentation. So I strongly urge you to read them. There are a brief discussion about the arguments in favor of free trade, the arguments about against free trade, related with jobs. Within this realm, Carvalho shows you outcries for protectionism often advocate for protection against cheap foreign labor. So table 4.11 shows you a comparison of manufacturing wages in 2007 in many other countries. As you can see, Canada pays higher than the US, Germany too, and they are able to maintain a better trade deficit, and Germany even has a trade surplus than us. So the hourly compensation is not the full story. It has also a lot to do with productivity. That's what table 4.12 is illustrating. So, for example, Hong Kong, labor productivity in Hong Kong is about a quarter of that of the US. The wages are about 57% of what workers are paid in the US, and therefore the cost of labor is 128% higher in Hong Kong than in the US. Because even though the wages are cheaper, the productivity is just 1/4 of that of the US. So at the end, they have to work 4 times more to do the same stuff as the American worker. This translates in the labor cost that is higher by a factor of 2.28 relatively to the United States. At the other end, there's the example of China, where labor productivity amounts to merely 9% of that of the US, and the wages are about 3% of those in the US. So even though the productivity is lousy, the wage is so low that at the end, the cost of labor is just about 33% of that of the US. So much more competitive in that sense. And what this is trying to reinforce is that when it comes to labor cost, the wages are not the full story. We also need to take into account the productivity levels. Other types of arguments are related to the fairness in trade. So this is one of the main reasons why the World Trade Organization exists, is to settle these disputes. The US has often complained about many countries, and it won most of its disputes against those countries. So I urge you to read the remaining slides and the textbook as well, of course. One of the most valid arguments that exists is the infant industry. Among all these arguments, the only one that creates some discussion among economists, well, more serious discussion, is related to the infant industry argument. The infant industry argument is typically used to protect these infant industries that are starting up in order to allow them to reach a more mature stage to compete globally. Now, this was the case of, for example, the solar industry that was initially protected in the US, so heavily subsidized. The technology was created here, but then there was a couple of bankruptcies among these pioneers of the technology. The most known one was the Solindra case, which went bankrupt and had received previously a $750 million subsidy, and that served as a reason for stopping to protect the solar industry. So as such, what happened was, even though the technologies were produced here, then we saw the shift in production, the use of that technology in China. And China now is the largest solar manufacturer in the world. So there was a trade-off there with economic consequences. And now we're trying to catch up in the solar industry production. Despite all these additional steps that have been taken recently in order to, for example, abandon the Paris Accord, which would serve as extra motivation to the furthering of renewable energy technologies, such as the solar industry. But the industry is resilient and is showing significant signs of improvement. So it should continue to grow, given the state of the world. Another severe force behind protectionism is the political economy, meaning the perceived gains for politicians in advocating these policies in terms of votes. So politicians tend to basically advocate for protectionist policies that brings them a lot of votes, not necessarily those that improve the welfare of the nation. So at the end, Carabao summarizes that the supply of protectionism depends on the cost to society, the political importance of the import competing producers, the adjustment costs, and the public sympathy. And the demand for protectionism depends on the comparative disadvantage, the import penetration, the concentration of that production, and our export dependence. I also would like to reinforce the fact that typically these protectionism disputes are won by those that are organized. So the industry organizes itself, being the producers or the workers, through contributions of lobbying dollars in order to alter the legislation. On the other hand, the consumers, they do not organize themselves in order to advocate for free trade. As most of the money comes from those that want protectionism, it's not surprising that a lot of those measures are implemented.